Okay, so you want to own a pawn shop, buy a storefront, put bars on the windows, wait for desperate people to walk in and hand over their jewelry for pennies on the dollar. That's the picture in your head, and it's almost completely wrong. The truth is, the resale counter is the least important part of the building. The real business happening inside a pawn shop has almost nothing to do with buying watches and reselling them for a markup. It's about pricing risk better than a bank ever could. A customer walks in with a Rolex worth $12,000. He walks out with $4,000 in cash. Most people watching that transaction assume the shop just stole a watch for a third of its value. That's not what happened. The shop didn't buy a watch at all. It underwrote a loan using the watch as collateral, and the $8,000 gap between what the watch is worth and what the customer received isn't sitting in a drawer as pure profit. It's a buffer built to absorb storage costs, insurance, market swings, and the very real chance that the loan never gets repaid at all. Once you understand that one distinction, the entire business flips inside out. So let's go inside it, piece by piece. Start with the question almost nobody asks. Why does this transaction even need to exist? Why can't that same customer just walk into a bank down the street and borrow $4,000 against the same watch? Because banks simply aren't built for this kind of lending. A bank underwrites you, not your watch. They want a credit score. They want proof of steady income. They want to run a background check and calculate a debt-to-income ratio, and all of that takes real staff hours, sometimes days, sometimes weeks, whether the loan ever gets approved or not. Picture the actual math from the bank's side. Processing a small personal loan application, even one that gets rejected, can easily cost a bank more in administrative labor than a few $100 interest income could ever recover. A bank that loses money processing small loans simply stops offering them. It isn't that banks refuse to help people who need quick cash. The underlying economics just don't support it at that scale. A pawnbroker skips almost all of it. No credit score, no income verification, no background check on the borrower as a person. The only thing being evaluated is the object sitting on the counter in front of them. Because the loan is non-recourse, meaning the pawnbroker's only remedy if the customer never pays is simply keeping the item, the shop never has to worry about the borrower's personal finances, their job history, or their ability to be tracked down later. Cash changes hands in 5 to 10 minutes start to finish. This is exactly why pawnbroking is considered one of the oldest financial systems on the planet, older than paper currency, older than double-entry bookkeeping, older than the very idea of a bank as we understand it today. Thousands of years before anyone invented a credit score, someone figured out that an object you can hold in your hand is sometimes a far more reliable guarantee than a stranger's promise to pay you back next month. Now here's where most people misunderstand the pricing entirely. Everyone assumes an item has one price, a single number, the kind you'd expect to see on a listing or a sticker. A pawnbroker looks at every single item through 3 completely different values, and the gaps between those 3 numbers are where the entire business model actually lives. The first number is retail value, what a patient buyer, on a good day, with plenty time to shop around, would eventually pay for the item in its best possible condition. The second number is liquidation value, what the shop can actually get in real cash within a day or two if it needed to offload the item immediately through a wholesaler, a refiner, or a professional buyer. With 0 patients involved, the third number, the one that actually determines what gets handed across the counter, is loan value. And loan value is never a percentage of retail. It's a conservative slice of liquidation value, because the pawnbroker isn't betting on the best case sale 3 months from now. They're betting on the worst case, the fire sale case, the case where the customer never walks back through that door. Run the math on a laptop that sells for $900 retail. Its liquidation value, what the shop could actually pocket fast through a wholesale buyer, might be closer to $500, and the loan issued against it caps out somewhere around $250 to $300, barely a third of the retail price. That's not the shop lowballing a customer out of greed. That's the shop protecting itself against a device that could be worth half as much the moment a new model gets announced next month. Now compare that laptop to a 14-karat gold ring worth $800 retail. Its melt value barely moves with fashion trends or technology cycles, so the loan against it can climb close to $300 to $360, a noticeably larger share of its worth. The object in front of the pawnbroker never changes in kind. The risk sitting behind it changes completely, and risk, not sentiment, is what sets the price on every single item that crosses that counter. And here's the trap most first-time owners fall straight into, because it sounds like nothing but good news when you first hear it. A generous loan-to-value ratio looks like a favor the customer and a smart way to win their loyalty. Offer 80% of retail instead of 30%, and surely more people walk through the door. Sounds like a smart growth strategy. Well, almost. The moment a shop lends too generously against an item, it stops being protected if that item's value slips even slightly before the loan term ends, or if the customer never earns at all. A shop that overlends on electronics, for example, can watch its collateral lose value faster than the loan clock is even running, so that by the time an unpaid item finally reaches the sales floor, it's worth less than what was advanced against in the first place. The conservative loan value isn't the shop being stingy. It's the only thing standing between a healthy balance sheet and a shelf full of assets quietly worth less than what they cost to acquire. Every customer walking through the door is also a different risk profile, and a good pawnbroker learns to read them almost instantly. There are emergency borrowers, people who need cash today because a car broke down or a utility bill is overdue, and who genuinely intend to come back for their item the moment they're able to. There are seasonal workers, contractors and gig workers whose power tools get pawned every winter slowdown and reclaimed the moment building season picks back up in spring. There are people who simply don't trust banks or don't qualify for one and would rather deal entirely in cash and collateral than paperwork and phone calls. And then there's a completely different customer on the retail side of the same store, the collector or the bargain hunter who has never pawned a single item in their life and just wants to find something strange and underpriced sitting on a shelf. These customer types don't just affect who walks through the door, they directly shape how a shop prices every single loan. An item with real sentimental weight to it, a wedding band, a family heirloom, tends to come back for redemption at a much higher rate than something purely functional like a phone charger or a spare power tool, simply because the owner is emotionally motivated to reclaim it no matter what it costs. Pawnbrokers quietly factor that emotional pull into their lending decisions. A ring might get a slightly more generous loan than its cold liquidation value alone would justify, precisely because the shop has learned, through years of repeat customers, that sentimental items almost always come home. Here's the part that surprises almost everyone who hasn't worked behind that counter. You'd assume a pawn shop's dream customer is the one who never comes back, the one whose item just sits there collecting dust before eventually getting sold off for a profit. It's actually the opposite. The most profitable customer, by a wide margin, is the one who returns again and again, pays the interest on time, and reclaims the item every single cycle. Think through why that's true. When a loan gets repaid or simply renewed for another cycle, the shop earns pure interest income, sometimes labeled in financial filings as a pawn service charge. There's no shelf space involved, no cleaning, no pricing research, no sales floor labor, no marketing, no card processing fee eating into the margin. Close to 100% of that fee drops straight down to profit. But the moment a loan defaults, the shop suddenly becomes an accidental retailer whether it wants to be one or not. It has to inspect the item, authenticate it, clean it, photograph it, price it against a moving secondary market, display it, and eventually sell it to a stranger who may or may not show up. Every one of those steps costs real money and real time. Nationally, something close to 85% of pawn loans actually get redeemed, according to survey data collected by the National Pawnbrokers Association, which tells you the entire business model is built around repeat lending relationships, not around permanently confiscating people's belongings. A shop that loses that repeat business isn't just losing a customer, it's losing its cheapest, highest margin source of income and replacing it with its most expensive one. And this is a good moment to pause for a second. If you're finding this rundown of the industry interesting so far, this is exactly the kind of channel where subscribing, liking, and sharing genuinely helps more of these breakdowns find their way to you. Alright, back to the shop floor. So what actually happens when a customer doesn't come back? First, in most states, the shop is legally required to hold the item untouched for a set grace period for doing anything with it at all. Sometimes 15 days, sometimes closer to 90, depending entirely on the jurisdiction. That's capital sitting completely frozen, earning nothing while the clock runs. Then comes authentication, checking serial numbers against databases, testing whether gold is genuinely gold, confirming electronics actually power on and hold a charge. Then refurbishing and cleaning, because nobody buys a scratched, dusty item at full price. Then pricing it against whatever the secondary market happens to be doing that particular month. Then, finally, actually selling it, which comes with its own layer of costs, staff time on the sales floor, card processing fees, security overhead, and the slow bleed of markdowns if the item sits unsold past 90 days. Every extra day an item stays on that shelf is a day that same capital isn't out in the world earning interest on a brand new loan instead. A default doesn't feel like a loss to most people watching from outside, since the shop still technically owns something valuable. But time is money in this business in exactly the same way it is in banking, and a slow-moving, unsold, forfeited item quietly erodes the return on the entire original transaction, sometimes turning what looked like a profitable loan into a break-even one. This is why pawnbrokers essentially memorize a private map of risk for every category of object that crosses the counter. Precious metal barely depreciates and resells almost instantly, so it earns some of the most generous loan terms in the entire store, often more than half of its melt value. Luxury watches carry enormous value inside a very small package, but they're also one of the most heavily counterfeited item categories in retail, so lending against them demands real, hard-won expertise. Firearms, where legal, hold their value remarkably well over time but come wrapped in heavy federal compliance requirements. Contractor tools stay in constant local demand, but wear out fast and carry a meaningfully higher chance of having been stolen before they ever reach the counter. And consumer electronics sit at the riskiest end of the entire spectrum, losing real value the moment a manufacturer announces a newer model. None of this is guesswork or intuition. It functions closer to underwriting, done in real time at a counter in under 10 minutes by someone with no spreadsheet open in front of them. If there's one material that changed this entire industry more than any other, it's gold. Unlike a laptop or a game console, gold doesn't become obsolete. It has no next generation waiting to make it worthless. Its price is set on a live global market, and it can be melted down and converted into hard cash almost anywhere on Earth within a single day. When a pawnbroker takes in a gold item, the artistry, the brand name, the sentimental story behind it, none of that factored into the loan calculation. What matters is weight and purity, measured against the live spot price at that exact moment. A shop typically pays a customer somewhere between 50 and 70% of that melt value for an outright sale, then later sells that same scrap on to a refinery for closer to 90 to 96% of its true value. That spread is close to guaranteed profit, and more importantly, it's genuinely liquid. During a slow month, when defaults are climbing and cash reserves are getting tight, a shop can turn its gold inventory into usable money almost overnight. It functions less like ordinary inventory sitting on a shelf and more like a savings account the business can quietly draw against whenever it actually needs to. Now think about what a single, completely ordinary pawn shop is holding at any given moment. Not tens of items, not even hundreds most of the time, often genuinely thousands. Hundreds of rings and necklaces locked in a display case, dozens of guitars and amplifiers lining a back wall, stacks of televisions, bins of power drills and saws, a wall of used game consoles and controllers. Every single one of those objects represents cash that has already been spent and is now sitting on a shelf instead of circulating back out as a new interest-earning loan. That's the quiet, unglamorous problem sitting at the center of this entire business. Inventory doesn't earn interest. It just sits there, tying up capital, taking up expensive square footage, needing insurance, needing security cameras, being someone to dust it every week. The entire skill of running a genuinely profitable shop comes down to turnover speed, getting items sold or getting loans repaid fast enough that money keeps circulating instead of quietly gathering dust behind a pane of glass. Well-run operations track this obsessively, aiming to cycle unredeemed inventory somewhere around 6 to 8 times a year. A shop that lets that number slip, where items linger for months instead of weeks, isn't just running an untidy store. It's running an inefficient bank, with capital parked in the least productive place it could possibly sit, and all of that inventory makes the shop a constant, unavoidable target for fraud. Fake gold plated thinly over a cheaper base metal. Counterfeit luxury watches good enough to fool an untrained eye at a glance. Lab-grown diamonds passed off confidently as natural mined stones. Electronics with serial numbers deliberately filed off. Outright stolen goods brought in by someone hoping nobody bothers to check. Modern shops fight back with real specialized tools. X-ray devices that read the exact metal composition of jewelry without damaging it at all. Density testers that catch gold-plated fakes in seconds. And even imaging software trained to compare the stitching and grain pattern of a handbag against millions of authenticated reference photos. Every transaction also gets logged with a government photo identification and reported into shared law enforcement databases, because a single overlooked stolen item can mean losing both the merchandise itself and every dollar advanced against it, with zero legal recourse to recover either one. Here's a strange twist that actually works entirely in the shop's favor. Because the merchandise on the floor is constantly changing, driven purely by whatever random mix of items customers happen to bring in that particular week, pawn shops accidentally created something no big-box retailer can easily replicate: a genuine treasure hunt. A shopper never knows today's visit turns up a vintage guitar, a rare coin, or a barely used power drill sitting at half the normal retail price. That unpredictability brings people back to simply browse with no shopping list at all, week after week, and it costs the shop nothing in advertising. The inventory does the marketing entirely by itself. None of this happens inside a lightly regulated bubble either. Pawnbroking is one of the more heavily regulated small businesses that exists anywhere in the country. States cap how much interest can be charged each month, and those caps vary enormously from one state line to the next. California caps monthly finance charges around 2.5%. Virginia allows up to about 7% a month. Illinois permits closer to 20%, and Mississippi allows combined pawn charges as high as 25% a month. Run that highest figure out across a full year, compounding the way these fees actually stack, and the effective annual percentage rate on some pawn loans can land well past 100%, and in certain cases beyond 200%. That's a genuinely expensive way to borrow money, and it's exactly why regulators keep such a close eye on this industry, even though every single fee involved is fully disclosed on the pawn ticket handed to the customer at the counter. Every transaction typically has to be logged in detail and reported to local police, often through shared regional databases used across an entire metro area. Firearms transactions bring in an entirely separate layer of federal paperwork on top of all of that, background checks run through national systems, and permanent record-keeping subject to unannounced federal audits. None of this is optional, and every part of it represents a genuine, ongoing operating cost, not just paperwork sitting in a filing cabinet. Then there's the internet, which changed the competitive landscape more than any single piece of regulation ever could. A customer today can list an item on an online marketplace and, in theory, walk away with something closer to full retail value for it. But that route takes days or weeks, comes bundled with the real risk of scams and buyers who simply never show up, and requires the seller to photograph, list, negotiate, and ship the item entirely on their own. A pawn shop can't compete on price against that. It doesn't need to. It's selling something the internet simply cannot offer. Cash in your hand within minutes, with zero risk of a buyer backing out after you've already shipped the box. Put all of these pieces together, and you start to see how the largest operators in this industry turn a single storefront into a business generating well over $1 million a year in revenue. Publicly traded chains like First Cash and Easy Corp, companies you've almost certainly driven past without ever noticing, run this exact playbook across hundreds of locations simultaneously. It's rarely built on one revenue stream alone. It's several stacked directly on top of each other. Interest and fees from active loans typically make up somewhere close to 40 to 50% of total revenue, and because that income requires almost no additional labor once the loan paperwork is written, it carries close to a full, near 100% profit margin. Retail sales of unredeemed, forfeited items usually contribute another large chunk on top of that, commonly in the 35 to 48% margin range. Scrap gold sales to refineries add a smaller but highly reliable profitable slice. Layer and jewelry repair services and bulk wholesale liquidation of aging stock, and you end up with a business that isn't dependent on any single stream to stay standing during a rough quarter. None of this means the business is free of real danger, and any serious owner needs to sit with these risks before writing a check. A sudden drop in gold prices can leave a shop holding jewelry worth less than the loans already issued against it, turning what looked like safe collateral into a paper loss almost overnight. A shift in local regulation can cap interest rates by legislative vote, compressing margins across an entire state with almost no warning. A wave of defaults during a recession can leave far too much cash frozen in unsold inventory at exactly the moment the shop needs liquidity the most, choking off its ability to write new, profitable loans. And because these stores routinely hold cash, gold, and sometimes firearms all under one roof, they remain a genuine target for robbery, which is precisely why serious security spending, cameras, reinforced glass, safes bolted to the floor isn't optional. It's survival. There's also a quieter risk that rarely gets talked about outside the industry itself, and it has nothing to do with crime. It's simply running out of cash to lend. A pawn shop's entire earning engine depends on having capital ready to hand across the counter the moment a customer walks in with something worth financing. If too much of that capital gets trapped in slow-moving retail inventory, the shop can find itself turning away good loans, the exact same loans that generate its highest margin income, simply because the money is tied up sitting on a shelf instead of circulating. A shop can be sitting on genuinely valuable inventory and still be functionally out of business, because value on a shelf isn't the same thing as cash in a drawer. So let's actually run the full numbers the way a prospective owner would sit